Friedrich Hayek had written a very stirring defense of economic and personal liberty during the war. And this book was called, does anybody know the name of the book? I bet some people here have read it. Bob? The Road to Serfdom, that's exactly right. The Road to Serfdom was a cry in the middle of the war. Hey, if we're not careful, we're going to do exactly what the people we're trying to defeat are doing. And so this economist, Friedrich Hayek, understood how ideas shaped society. Now, the former fighter pilot thought that the best way to get his government back on track would be to run for office, get involved in politics. But Hayek told him, you know, you have an understanding of these ideas that would allow you to do something more. He said, you'd be wasting your time if all you did was get involved in politics. You need to get involved in ideas because ultimately the intellectuals will determine how the politicians act. Think about that. Now, Hayek called these politicians, Hayek called these developers of ideas, these intellectuals, second-hand dealers in ideas. Second-hand dealers. Now, he didn't mean that as an insult. He merely recognized that there are actually very, very few people generating truly new, original ideas. There's nothing new under the sun. Almost all of the other intellectuals contribute to the march of ideas by developing the ideas, communicating those ideas, or expanding the influence of the ideas along the way. So later economists have observed that these ideas follow sort of a predictable progression through society. Joe, you want to show the next slide? And here is how ideas transfer through society. Starting with the idea originators, a very rare bunch of people, then down to the intellectuals or the second-hand dealers of ideas. And today we might call those people, or might be people in the media, they might be people in universities, they might be people at think tanks. And then to the culture at large, and finally to the political class. So what do you notice about this transfer? The change doesn't start with politics. In fact, the political step is merely the last step in a long march toward converting an idea into a policy change. Now, new ideas are seldom met with open arms, right? Ideas are ridiculed, especially by the people who are making their living on the old ideas. The ideas that eventually make their way into law typically meet with responses that look like this next slide. This is a progression for the response to those ideas. First, it's indifferent. They'll ignore you. And then you know you're making progress and they ridicule you when they make fun of you. Then it's rejection and on to attack and criticism. I'll read through the list because I know the letters are small in the back. After criticism is where they have to really start grappling with your idea. They have to say, well, here's why your idea won't work. Here's why it won't work, Joe, to put privately owned roads in Missouri. Here's why it won't work to scrap the income tax and replace it with something else. And then a plausible or partial consideration. Well, Joe, your idea would work if it were a little different. Or if we could maybe try part of your idea. Well, then we move to tolerance, and then desirability, and then necessity, and then inevitability, and acceptance, and finally, hey, I knew it was a good idea all along. I mean, that's where Social Security is today. Social Security started out as an idea that was so untenable that no one paid it any serious attention except for the intellectuals developing it. Well, now, as far as society is concerned, how could we live without it? And so, if we know this about ideas and how they move through society, how can we influence public policy? Next slide. Hayek said that politicians are sort of like actors, but we can write the script. In other words, politicians can't do anything that they want. And I'm getting a big smile out of Mr. Jetton. Hayek said to this fighter pilot, whose name was Anthony Fisher, politicians are like corks bobbing in the ocean. You can be the current. Okay? So one of my colleagues at the Mackinac Center actually developed a model that shows how ideas progress from one phase to the next. How do those, and how do think tanks change public policy? Joe, show us the next slide. And we've called it the Overton window of political possibility. It's named after my colleague Joe Overton. And what we have here is a list of government policies on education. And for those of you who can read the list clearly, I'd like you to just shout out if you notice any pattern. These are organized in a specific way. Can you tell me what the pattern is? These are all public policies on education. At the very top is no government schools, and at the bottom is compulsory indoctrination in government schools.
The bottom is where we are.
Joe DeLong said the bottom is where we are. That's close. These are organized in order at the bottom of the scale from less freedom at the top of the scale to more freedom. Or another way to say it is from more government to less government involvement in education. All right? And this isn't to say whether any of these policies are good or bad. That's just how they're organized here. So now I want to actually switch to another device on my computer. Here we have the same list of educational policies. And I'm going to show you what the window of political possibility looked like in Michigan when the Mackinac Center was founded. I've shaded the areas that were within the window of what was politically possible. And what do I mean by the window of political possibility? What I mean is what we said before. Politicians are not free to support any policy they want, because if they vote for something that the voters consider too radical, they'll get bounced out of office. And politicians typically want to stay in office. And so at any given time, there's a certain range of ideas that are not too hot, not too cold, just right, as Goldilocks would say. And the just right ones are within the window of political possibility. So in Michigan, when the Mackinac Center was founded, homeschooling was illegal. And at the top of the scale, we had a state-mandated curriculum. There was no public school choice at all in Michigan. So you couldn't even choose what government school you wanted to go to. Well, you could, but you had to buy a house in the right district. That was how you exercised school choice in 1988. So notice a couple of things about the window. First of all, it's down on the lower part of the scale, and it's also kind of narrow. If you were an elected official in 1988 in Michigan and you wanted to talk about charter schools, for example, that was very risky politically and would probably get you bounced from office. So you couldn't even talk about it. But when the second-hand dealers in ideas can talk about these ideas and analyze them and show how they might work, two things can happen. First of all, you can shift the window up and make it safe to talk about public school choice or charter schools. And you can also make the window bigger. It doesn't even have to stay the same size. So I'll show you the window now in Michigan in education policy after the Mackinac Center had been in business for about 10 years. It actually became safe to talk about vouchers and tax credits. I'll put the window right there. Homeschooling was broadly legalized, and now any politician in Michigan who wants to talk about making it illegal is going to run some real political risks. It's really not quite safe to talk about. And at the top of the scale, you can talk about tuition tax credits and vouchers without getting run out of office.